All right, so we're shining a spotlight on the crisis around informal settlements. We're going to have Prof.Alex van den Heever to weigh in on that conversation, perhaps looking at the crisis currently in South Africa, perhaps also what are the interventions that are needed. We're also trying to reimagine the economic logic for some of the towns and metros, how urbanization is also impacting to the gross overpopulation that we're witnessing in some parts of the country. So to have this conversation, Prof.Alex van den Heever, in fact, from the Wits School of Governance, joins us to weigh in on the informal settlement crisis in South Africa. Prof. Alex, good afternoon, and thank you for your time with us here on the SABC.
Good afternoon.
So, in view of what transpired on Saturday, more lives having been lost, perhaps we could get your sentiments about how we begin to address the issue of informal settlements in South Africa.
Well, what we're experiencing in at least two provinces is a significant growth in population as people move from rural areas into the large urban spaces. So we see significant population growth in Gauteng and the Western Cape. And what this does is it places a very significant burden on the governments of these provinces to manage the urbanization process. Included in this is sort of cross-border migration, so immigration as well, that would also need to be properly managed. And what we're seeing, though, is a failure really to keep up with the requirements to ensure that there is orderly urban development. And it appears as though, to a large extent, we just see government basically stepping aside. And it suggests that the authorities and the key people in charge are just not ahead of the game. And despite the fact that this is a long-term matter that requires that you have an ongoing coherent strategy to deal with it, it appears as though, as with many other areas when we're dealing with a long-term issue, people just fail to do the basics.
Prof, thank you for those sentiments. You've spoken about urbanization and immigration, including the failure to keep up with the requirements. And given the high unemployment rates also in the country, I wonder how some of these big contributing factors, exacerbate the issue of informal settlements at this point. Is South Africa developing at a pace that it is able to perhaps empower smaller cities, avoid migrations to bigger cities if planning is implemented better?
Well, if we were looking at spreading the load, so to speak, between various metros around the country, that has also been failing, mainly because of a failure of governance in many of those cities. So the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, which are potentially viable settlement areas and investment areas for economic growth. They've effectively been undermined by poor infrastructure development, essentially massive corruption and a failure in public services. And all of those things are necessary for economic growth. That's an enabling factor. And it's also an enabling factor in Johannesburg as well, and Gauteng. The electricity crisis has basically taken a very big chunk out of our economic growth as well. So our urbanization probably could have been managed. People are moving to areas where the potential for employment is highest. In other words, the metros, Johannesburg, Pretoria, Midrand, eThekwini, and in the Eastern Cape metros and the Western Cape. Those are the areas where you can expect employment to be, surplus employment to be absorbed. But basically, if we undermine the growth potential of these areas through poor management, incredible corruption, phenomenal corruption in infrastructure and housing projects, then we're not going to keep pace either with economic growth or with the urbanization process itself. And what we end up with is what we're seeing is chaos. And this really is something that can be managed, should be managed by competent authorities, and I'm afraid to say we don't have them. We don't have competent authorities operating at the national or provincial level and in many of the metros. The governments are too corrupt to do the basics and are not focused on actual service delivery. And when we start to talk about crisis, we're actually talking about something that has taken about 15 to 20 years to become a crisis. It's always been predictable. The growth in these provinces is very clear. The population growth in Gauteng is predictable for years. You can see it annually what the growth is. And a large number of people are coming to Gauteng on an ongoing basis. So you have to have a plan. If you don't work on it, you're going to be overwhelmed by it.
Prof, so as we're speaking then, what is a viable political economy for South Africa? How do we begin to explore the diversification of capital accumulation, develop other zones in the country, perhaps reimagine the economic logic of cities and metros to ensure this growth or inclusivity at large? What about the whims of the region and how it makes South Africa vulnerable as well, but also opens it up to grow?
Well, one of the fundamental requirements or prerequisites for getting on top of these issues is the capability of the various governments that we're dealing with. So yes, there are absolutely viable strategies that can essentially distribute the potential for growth, diversify growth within South Africa. But the part that has to be played by government requires a very, very capable set of actors. And if you're not capable, then you can't really make what are obvious plans work at the end of the day. We're not seeing things hit the ground. And this is where our problems lie, is that we're a country that is continuously changing. And our problems are complex. They're not beyond addressing. But we are a country that could be growing very significantly. We could be developing incredible cities. But what we see is that people have essentially taken over cities and over provinces and act as if it's their personal property. We need capable government and people who are actually focused on the job. We don't have that at the moment, but that is the first prerequisite for getting any kind of strategy to work.
Prof, thank you for your time with us on the SABC and for those sentiments. Prof.Alex van den Heever from the Wits School of Governance weighing in on the informal settlement crisis in South Africa.